So my name is Eric Lichtenberger. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm from the Illinois Education Research Council, which is inconveniently located at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. I'm here today to present to you the results of our early implementation study, and the title's up there, the Early Childhood Educator Preparation Innovation Grants, Lessons from Early Implementation. It's somewhat of a mouthful, but before I begin with the presentation, I want to acknowledge my colleague and co-author on the report, Brenda Klosterman. She couldn't be here today. I wanted to acknowledge her significant contribution, as well as the contribution of Dan Duffy, who's a graduate student at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville in the clinical psychology department. But I think Dan will introduce himself a little bit later. Can you click? So I don't get in trouble with my boss, I am going to briefly talk about the Illinois Education Research Council. Our mission is to provide objective and reliable evidence for P20 education policy making and program development. We're the legislated arm, research arm of the Illinois P20 Council. And there is my spiel on the IERC. So what we will discuss today is the background and purpose of our implementation study, as well as the methods we employed. And then we'll go into the results, the exciting part, and then some recommendations. Now keep in mind, these recommendations were based on our analysis, but a lot of them were embedded in a lot of the responses that we received from the interviewees. And then we'll open the floor up for your comments and questions. So in terms of the background, I'm going to call the overarching grant system the EPPI grant. So the purpose of this overarching grant system was to develop models of effective early childhood educator preparation. The second major goal was to foster the development of partnerships between community colleges and four-year institutions in terms of their preparation programs. But the idea was to also integrate community-based partners such as school districts and Head Start agencies. A third goal, and this was kind of a foundational aspect of the EPPI grant, was to promote articulation. The fourth goal was to support early childhood education programs in designing curriculum to incorporate new program requirements, such as the EdTPA, which was talked about earlier today. And the fifth goal was to build capacity in key areas of need, such as ESL, ELL, early literacy, and early math. And the final goal was to create opportunities for innovative program implementation, not specific to curricular enhancements, things that might help the community college students better transition to their receiving four-year institution. So the purpose of our implementation study was to examine the initial implementation of the proposed grant activities. We also wanted to identify barriers that might prevent goal attainment from happening or prevent the partnerships from being fully developed. We also wanted to identify catalysts and levers that provided opportunities for the partnerships to overcome the barriers. And we also wanted to consider the sustainability of the grant's impact outside the scope of the grant and the time frame of the grant as well. Now, we presented initial results back in December at a meeting of the grant recipients that took place at St. Xavier University, which up until a week ago I thought was in Oak Lawn, but it's actually in the city of Chicago, just outside of Oak Lawn. So if you're from St. Xavier, I apologize. I think somebody corrected me in the report. And when we were presenting our initial results, somebody suggested that we should look into partnership development theory as a way to frame our qualitative analysis and as an additional lens to interpret the results. And I believe it was Catherine Main. So if Catherine Main is here, thank you very much for suggesting that. Somebody else suggested change theory, and we initially contemplated doing that as well, but we felt that due to the short-term nature of the grant, we didn't have enough time to actually see if true change occurred. So we opted to use partnership development theory. And we found that many of the themes and subtopics that we identified in our qualitative analysis paralleled the benefits, challenges, and success factors identified in a study from a researcher named McQuaid. He's actually British. And what was interesting was that his study had nothing to do with education. His study was related to job placement agencies in Great Britain. But what I found in reading his interpretation of partnership development theory was that we could almost take out job placement agencies in Great Britain and put in the state of Illinois and developing community college and four-year institution partnerships, and it probably would have been an easy fit. So it almost aligned perfectly, and it almost seemed as though the people who developed the EPPI grant almost took this into consideration when they were going through their thought process and coming up with the requirements for the grant in and of itself. But moving on. I'm just preaching to the choir here. I'm an outsider, so essentially I'm providing you with my outside perspective. And I always knew that early childhood education was quite complex, but I didn't know how complex it was until I actually was engaged in this study. So there's a high degree of complexity regarding early childhood education itself, as well as in the preparation of early childhood educators. ECE is inclusive of a wide array of roles and responsibilities within numerous public and private settings, both within and outside of schools. And also, depending upon an early childhood educator's role or roles and their responsibilities, there could be multiple degree, licensing, and/or credentialing requirements emanating from one or more agencies. And relatedly, there are numerous entry points into the early childhood workforce, this is what I learned, that result in a wide range of jobs, such as teacher, teacher's aide, teacher's assistant, caregiver, administrator, and that's just to name a few. Next, I'll provide you with an overview of our methods. They were fairly simplistic. What we did first and foremost was systematically reviewed the proposal narratives for each project. Then we developed the interview protocol. And then we did the fun part, which was conducting the interviews. And then the not so fun part, coding the responses. And then this was the fun part, once again, analyzing the responses for overarching themes and subtopics, as well as looking at how they fit into partnership development theory as described by McQuaid. But we began our implementation review by reviewing the proposal narratives. And what we wanted to do was provide a framework to capture the information that might be unique to each partnership. But we also looked at the commonalities and the overlap. I'm pointing to encourage Dan to move on to the next bullet point. And the overlap tended to focus on improving or enhancing articulation between the community colleges and the four-year institutions, partnership development. There was a lot of information on the Gateways credentials, fully incorporating that not only into programs, but into the entire transfer process. Also, addressing emerging standards and program requirements, such as the EdTPA and the new professional teaching and learning standards and the new specific early childhood educator standards that came out earlier this year. And then finally, improving field-based experiences. So in terms of developing the interview protocol, we went through several iterations. We actually started with the proposal narratives to develop a draft version, and then we obtained some feedback internally at the IERC, as well as with a consultant that we hired who had a lot of background experience in program evaluation, as well as in early childhood education. And then we obtained feedback from the Board of Higher Education, INCRA, and the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development. More specifically, we received feedback from Stephanie Bernatite, Joni Scritchlow, and Christy Chadwick, so thank you very much. And after integrating their feedback into what was almost a final draft, we received some additional feedback from Stephanie Bernatite from IBHE. But to be honest, we actually made some slight adaptations after the first couple of interviews, so I apologize if you were one of the first people we interviewed because those tended to be longer. After the first couple of interviews, we streamlined some of the questions to cut back on the length. And I apologize to PIs. The PI interviews tended to be quite a bit longer than the interviews with the other partners. But the questions on the interview protocol tended to focus on the major goals and activities associated with each specific project, such as the barrier, and we also looked at the barriers to implementation, catalysts and levers allowing for implementation, innovations and enhancements specific to articulation, as well as program and curricular enhancements. Focusing on such things as early math and early literacy and ESL. But we also wanted to look at impacts. How would these grant-based activities actually impact things? But what we were having trouble with was that the time frame of the grant was fairly short. So what we did was we looked at real impacts and potential impacts. So we wanted to focus on the structure that was put into place to see how that would potentially impact things in the future. We also wanted to know how far along the partners were in implementing the process, and we wanted to look at ways in which new standards and program requirements were being met, not only specific to articulation, but overall in their programs. And then finally, we solicited their overall thoughts about the grant process as a whole. And that's the information we provided at the meeting at St. Xavier. In the end, we developed 4 different versions of the interview protocol. We started with one that was specific to the 4-year institutions and then slightly adapted it to make it better suited for the community college partners. And then we realized that the community-based agencies really weren't all that interested in articulation, so we focused more on field-based experiences when we were interviewing the community-based partners, such as those associated with Head Start programs. And then we figured out that there were several people associated with more than one grant or more than one partnership. So we had to create a slightly different version of the protocols instead of interviewing those people multiple times. So we added 3 questions at the end for those who were a part of multiple grants. Now, in terms of the interview participants, we worked with the PIs as well as Stephanie Bernatite from IBHE, and we identified 53 individuals from the 12 project sites. 48 were unique. Actually, I guess everyone's unique. There were 48 unduplicated potential interview participants. 21 were from 4-year institutions, 23 were from community colleges, and 4 were from community-based agencies, most of them being from Head Start programs. And as I previously mentioned, there was some overlap, and 5 of the individuals were associated with more than one EPPI grant. And in the end, we happened to interview 45 people. And I argue that we had a 100% response rate. 2 of the people that were identified for interviews were fiscal officers at the given institution, and they didn't know anything about the grant other than how much money was going to be spent. So we opted not to interview them. And then one person had a family crisis the week they were scheduled to be interviewed, so we let that person off the hook. And I'm not taking credit for this 100% response rate. I think the credit goes to you because you were so enthusiastic about the project. And everyone was more than excited to talk to us, which was a good thing to do. In terms of characteristics of the grantees, they were evenly split between the public 4-year institutions and private 4-year institutions, so there were 12 partnership sites in total. However, one of the private 4-year institutions was located in Iowa, but worked heavily with partners based in Illinois. It should be noted that one of the grant requirements was that a 4-year institution had to be the grant holder. There were 19 individual community colleges from 17 different community college districts. In terms of the geographic location of the grantees, it's much like the distribution of the population in Illinois and the distribution of the preparation programs. They seem to all fall into the Chicagoland area. But, I mean, most of the population lives above I-80, so, and it should be noted that I don't. I live outside of St. Louis. It should be noted that this was a competitive process, and, just go back. Yeah, you're trigger happy. There's only one 4-year institution located in this region and only 4 located in this region. So, and I think that in the second round, they focused a little bit more heavily on the central part of the state and the southern part of the state. Is that right? Okay. So moving on, in terms of our interview process, if you ever want to duplicate this, we digitally recorded the interviews after begging for permission to do so from each of the interviewees. Using those digital recordings and our notes, we developed detailed summaries structured with the interview protocol. And then we provided the interviewee with the opportunity to clarify statements, retract statements entirely, or even provide entirely new information. In some instances, we wanted clarification from some of the interviewees, so we would ask them and put it in tracked changes on the Microsoft Word document. And with the validated summaries, we got them back and we cleansed them of any identifying information specific to individuals as well as specific to their institutions and partnerships. And then we uploaded that to a qualitative software package and started the coding process. So we had 45 interviews, so by default, we had tons and tons of text. So what we did was we started reading it. We identified specific text segments related to the objectives of our implementation study, and then we labeled those segments of text to create different categories. We reduced the overlap and redundancy among those categories, and in the end we created a model incorporating the most important categories, and what we were left with was the major goals of our implementation study, which was to identify barriers, look at long-term and mediating impacts. We wanted to focus on catalysts, and then we also had this strange category called frameworks. A lot of people talked about the redesign of early childhood education programs in somewhat of a matter-of-fact or neutral fashion, and they weren't talking about it in terms of barriers, and they weren't talking about it in terms of opportunity, so it really wasn't a catalyst. So when it was described in a neutral fashion, these new standards and new program requirements, we put them into this framework category. So our coding structure was somewhat based on the interview protocol and somewhat related to the overarching goals of our project. And each theme had between 2 and 6 subtopics. But before I get into the themes and the subtopics, I wanted to briefly go over everyone's motivation for participating in the grant in the first place. I think universally everybody mentioned articulation as being a major goal and a major reason for participating in this grant. That's the bridge between the community colleges and the four-year institutions. They also wanted to build partnerships and networks among community colleges and four-year programs, and not only within their partnership, but a lot of individual colleges mentioned extending what they were doing outside of their given partnership. And the four-year institutions also discussed the potential for increased enrollment and recruitment of transfer students, as well as the increase in diversity in their early childhood students, which was kind of interesting. There was this acknowledgement that the four-year institutions could better work with the community colleges, not only to maintain or increase their institutional enrollments, but also to diversify their pool of early childhood educators. And finally, increasing the bachelor's completion rates of the transfer students. That was a universally desired outcome. But once again, we couldn't measure that in the time frame of the current grant. Moving on. Some of the motivation was also student-centered. And related to that, a lot of the respondents mentioned the need to smoothing out the transition between one's community college and their receiving four-year institution. And this was usually described in the context of decreasing credit loss that happens, or that has traditionally happened, as well as increasing affordability for students, not only in terms of real costs, but also opportunity costs. Another motivation related to students' needs was providing support to pass the test of academic proficiency or meet the ACT substitute score with the ACT plus writing. And another motivation was creating opportunities to provide secondary ESL endorsements to the students and developing support structures to help the students succeed after they transfer to their receiving four-year institution. And finally, to me, the most important motivating factor for a lot of these partnerships was to increase the marketability and employability of the graduates, which I think is a noble cause. Now on to our barriers. As I previously stated, we had some institutional barriers and we had some systemic barriers. I'm going to focus on the institutional barriers first. Now these were institution or partnership specific. They prevented goal attainment and or partnership development. However, I want you to know that they were mostly historical in nature. A lot of the respondents were just trying to provide context for what was going on in terms of their current partnership. And the good news was they were often wedded to a catalyst. And many times people would mention some sort of historical barrier that existed in the past and how the grant directly resulted in some sort of activity that helped them deal with what was going on in the past. And some of the subtopics within institutional barriers were bureaucratic treading. We all operate within institutional context, and we all have to deal with red tape. Another subtopic was past issues with articulation, and as I previously mentioned, these were usually historical. Issues with advising were another subtopic within institutional barriers, and many people mentioned the need for clearly communicated transfer pathways, not only for transfer coordinators and advisors who work outside of early childhood education, but also for the students, more importantly. And then some people described major institutional changes as a barrier to fully actualizing what was going on in their grant, such as turnover or programmatic change. And then here's some representative quotes within that theme in terms of bureaucratic treading. Let me read this. So what always seemed to get lost is when things move from the faculty member to faculty member, they are fine because they know each other and they are in the same field. But when it advances through the systems that are in place, people don't understand. In terms of past issues with articulation, the institution has historically struggled with articulation and transfer for students. Most of these are direct quotes. In terms of issues with advising, previously transfer was up to the discretion of whoever was in the counseling office and was more vague. Major institutional change. The original grant proposal was developed by 2 administrators, both of whom are no longer in those positions and are no longer in the College of Education. So the disconnect between the grant writer and the person who was charged with executing the activities associated with the grant somewhat was a barrier, or was somewhat of a barrier. Okay, so the next set of barriers were more systemic. They were global or common among multiple partnerships, and they defined the challenging contexts in which the partnerships were operating. And for the most part, they impeded the timely attainment of goals. And I'll go on to some of the subtopics within this systemic barriers theme. One of the most common one was logistical difficulties, and these mostly centered on time-related issues. Now, what we found in many of the responses was that a lot of these early childhood programs, whether or not they were at a community college or a 4-year institution, were fairly small. In fact, a lot of the community college programs were programs with one faculty member who also served as an administrator who oversaw several adjunct faculty members. So they described the difficulty they had in engaging in grants or activities that would have been done in the grant in the past because of time constraints. And also a few people mentioned time-related issues specific to the grant itself in that it was only a year. Initiative overload was another subtopic within the systemic barriers theme, and it was related to new standards, initiatives, and program requirements. And then another one that was somewhat complex were ascribed characteristics of early childhood students, particularly those at community colleges. And like I said, this was complex, and a lot of times they were describing the dual nature of early childhood students at community colleges. And this wasn't universal. They weren't saying that all community college students who are interested in early childhood had these characteristics, but they did acknowledge the fact that some have difficulty passing the TAP once they transfer to their 4-year institution, or have difficulty meeting the requisite score on the ACT, which is a 22. However, the same group of students, they bring in with them numerous experiences. Many of them are bilingual and trilingual, and they have a thorough understanding of their communities. So it was kind of an interesting set of responses within that theme, and we describe it a little bit further in the report. And in terms of institutional bias, a few of the community college partners provided responses that provided us with the notion that 4-year institutions have traditionally been viewed higher on the educational hierarchy. Sometimes they described how some people view their programs as being more academically rigorous, but once again, this was kind of a historical context. And then complexity of early childhood education. This was generally discussed in the student context, and I'll provide you with some representative quotes in 1 second. In terms of the logistical difficulties, I tell this to my boss all the time. Good things don't happen in 3 months. Creativity takes time. In terms of initiative overload, which we all suffer from or have to deal with, Illinois teaching requirements have changed, and consequently courses need to be changed. Individual institution requirements also caused additional fitting of puzzle pieces. In terms of characteristics of early childhood students, the dual nature of early childhood students, I learned that community college students are a very different group than typical 4-year students. Many work full-time, commute to school, etc. In terms of institutional bias, what was interesting about institutional bias is that somebody else mentioned the notion that some of their community college students also maintain somewhat of a bias, and it's somewhat reflected in this statement. This isn't a direct quote, it's kind of a summary. These students seem to perceive the community college as more or less a continuation of high school, and they're ready for something different, meaning they're ready to move on to a 4-year. In terms of the complexity of early childhood education, which I described earlier, if community college students are provided with any more information related to the hurdles of passing, let alone meeting the costs of additional expectations, they may further see entering the field of education as unenticing and overwhelming. Okay, now that's the bad stuff. Now on to the catalysts that allowed these partnerships to overcome those barriers. So these catalysts provided movement towards goal attainment, and many were adopted directly from McQuaid's description of partnership development theory. And they were often a response or reaction to a historical or contextual barrier. And some of the subtopics within the catalyst theme, and I think this was the most important one, this idea of mutualism or shared philosophy or shared values, which centered on gaining a contextual understanding of the partners, and not only the institutions, but the institution's students. Next, there was the capacity for cooperation, which was related to the ability of the individual partners to effectively engage in the partnership and make decisions and add value to the process. Another important one was that the grant itself provided the impetus for a lot of these goals to be met, or at least the framework for the goals to be met, to be established. So the grant provided the structure and support. Sorry, can you go back for a second, Dan? The grant provided the structure and support to meet the goals. And there were a few more subtopics. We had innovative steps. We found that a lot of the partnerships were doing innovative things specific to advising, also specific to test preparation. I previously mentioned the TAP exam as a barrier and the ACT as a barrier. Also, some people were doing some interesting things related to dissemination and sharing. In fact, it seemed as though they were going out of their way to make sure that everybody else knew all of the wonderful things they were doing in terms of their curricular enhancements. Also, the integration of community college transfer students at the four-year college was another innovative step that we found, and we'll discuss that later. Also, people seem to be using technology quite a bit as a catalyst, and a lot of times technology was placed in the context of overcoming barriers that were either systemic or institutional, as described in our theme framework. Also, a lot of the respondents described an integral player, and a lot of times that person was a PI. In terms of some of the representative quotes, shared values. Previously, these discussions have been an institutional focus. Now they are focused on the students. Capacity for cooperation. The opportunity to meet face-to-face was great. Communicating with them via email is one thing, but gaining an understanding of them as people and knowing their teaching styles was extremely beneficial. In terms of grant-provided impetus, the grant was the dike to hold off other responsibilities and commitments for a short time to focus on the grant-specific activities. In terms of innovative steps, this one is specific to dissemination. Additionally, everything that is done is being presented to a wider audience. When possible, the two-year representative is included in these presentations. In terms of use of technology, the only barrier is distance from the other meetings, which was fixed by an online meeting service. In terms of integral player, the participant reported the importance of proper leadership from a non-authoritarian principal investigator who is very open to the ideas of all of the partners. Now on to the impacts. So we separated the impacts into two categories. We had potential long-term impacts as well as mediating impacts. The potential long-term impacts were overarching. However, they couldn't be measured in the time frame of the current grant. Some of the subtopics within the potential long-term impacts theme included the professionalization of the early childhood workforce, which involved raising the aggregate level of professional experience in the field. Pathways was another one of the potential long-term impacts, and it involved increasing the number of educational and/or career pathways for early childhood students. Enrollment, the impacts on enrollment for both sides of the partnership, so from the perspective of the four-year institutions and the community colleges alike. In terms of societal and systemic improvement, larger societal impacts with a heavy emphasis on improved learning situations for children. And I remember one quote specifically. Somebody mentioned that we're in the business of providing education to the people who raise the children of this area, which I think was somewhat powerful. In terms of professionalizing the early childhood workforce, here's a select quote. We want to raise the ability to be able to talk to the general public, families, school district, legislators about issues. And now they'll have that language. In terms of pathways, this articulation will make early childhood education more affordable for students, will allow them to work while they are in college, and allow them to move around. In terms of enrollment, the partnering institutions will benefit from well-trained students who want to go on to become teachers who could also diversify the teaching pool. and then societal and systemic improvement. Ultimately, our clients are young children, so we want the best possible program and the best model of delivery. Now on to mediating impacts, which were somewhat starting during the time frame of the grant, so they were a direct result of the grant. But they were somewhat precursory in nature, in that they weren't fully actualized. But we felt like they were the framework for the longer-term impacts or the longer-term goals to actually be met. And there were 3 of them. And the first one was programmatic improvements. So and these improvements generally involved both the depth and the scope of the curricula. In terms of partnership development, it was both a grant-related impact and a catalyst that allowed for the other grant-related goals to be accomplished. And in terms of enhanced articulation, it provided the framework for many of the other grant-related activities, and it had a precursory relationship with attaining other goals. And it was actually a foundational aspect of the EPPI grant system. And here are some representative quotes within this theme. In terms of programmatic improvement, they are now getting exposure throughout their college experience rather than right at the end when they do their student teaching. This was in terms of field-based experiences. In terms of partnership development, the partners, the institutions, and the individuals are the main reason that I believe this grant has been working so successfully. In terms of enhanced articulation, they're still working on articulation, which was somewhat common among the partnerships, but they're hoping for a seamless 2+2 program. Okay, this is the last theme, and it's frameworks. And as I previously described, we categorized any responses related to new program requirements or program redesign that were neutral into the framework category. And some of the subtopics within this frameworks theme included considering new program requirements, and this was usually framed with the gateways credentials. And the most common framing of programs, particularly articulation agreements between community colleges and 4-year institutions that use the gateways credentials, seem to be having the community college students earn a level 3 along with their associate degree, and then a level 5 at their receiving 4-year institution along with a bachelor's degree. And some of the partnerships involved a full licensure through ISB as well. And then the new early childhood education program redesign. And as we all know, early childhood education as a whole is in transition. It seems like most of education is always in transition, with several emerging program requirements. And here are some representative quotes, and then I'm done with these themes. Considering new program requirements. Credentialing will be worked right into the coursework. When students enter their first semester, they will be enrolled and walked through the Gateways registry. In terms of new ECE program redesign, the first goal was a complete redesign of the early childhood program to address the evolving standards, including those stemming from various bodies such as state and professional organizations. Now, I wanted to highlight some of the information we presented at St. Xavier. We also analyzed the last item on the interview protocol, which was just give us your overall thoughts of the grant process as a whole. And for the most part, they were almost exclusively positive, the responses. And many of the respondents mentioned their intentions or hopes of applying again and receiving more funding to continue their partnership and to further the activities related to articulation. And here's some representative quotes. Grant opportunities like these push us to do this difficult work that we would not have done otherwise. This grant provides a wonderful and outstanding model. And there were some people who mentioned their initial skepticism with the grant, but they seemed to be pleasantly surprised at the end. Often wondered if it would all lead to the end goal of reaching the students, but it did. It was incredibly worthwhile to go through the whole process. There were also views that the grant process served as a catalyst for new dialogue and conversation. The grant allowed for a bigger conversation of the educational system as a whole, so kind of a P20 focus, and has allowed for institutions to realize how similar they are. So moving beyond that idea of institutional bias. So those people that applied for the grant are not only motivated to help their institutions, but they're also motivated to help the profession. And this is the last slide that we presented at St. Xavier. And it provided the viewpoint that the overall structure and support associated with the grant were highly beneficial, probably a little bit more so than the money, but the money was also important. So the grant provided the structure and support necessary to accomplish the goals, and move from talk and discussion to action. I think that's a very powerful quote. And the money is the draw for this kind of work, but the money isn't sustained in terms of following through. But because the grant got us started, it contributed to both the commitment and to the work. All right, now moving on, these are some of the major findings. We're almost done with the PowerPoint slides. What we found was that most of the partnerships were moving towards achieving their grant-related goals. And the grants had a fairly large positive impact, particularly in terms of partnership development. However, we argue that some of the partnerships were more authentic than others. However, all of the partnership grants had a solid structure in place. So they could, too, be authentic in the future. They also enhanced articulation pathways between the partners. That was also an important finding. And we also found a lot of evidence of the integration of the Gateway's credentials into the programs, as well as a direct integration into the transfer process itself. And I think that was highly important. Also, some of the themes and subtopics that were established in analyzing the interview responses were directly related to key ideas within partnership development theory as described by McQuaid. And as I previously stated, when we found barriers, they were often wedded to a catalyst. So this less than ideal thing was happening in the past, but because of the grant or the grant-related activities, we were able to overcome it. Now back to slightly less positive news. Views regarding the grant system and the partnerships were not universally positive. A few people mentioned the notion that the grant system perpetuated existing biases. A couple of the community college partners thought that it was slightly unfair that they couldn't be holders of the grant, so that if they wanted to partner with, so if they wanted to partner with multiple four-year institutions, it required them to be associated with more than one grant, and it wasn't the same way for four-year institutions. The short time frame of the grant was sometimes viewed in a negative light. A couple people mentioned the quick turnaround that was required in order to submit a proposal, as well as the overall length of the grant, which was only a year. And then another interviewee mentioned that although the partnership in question has traditionally been strong and continued to be strong, the grant really didn't lead to significant change, either positive or negative. And then when we sent you out the report, we actually talked about a couple ideas that we thought were highly innovative, and we placed them in the context of some of the current literature. I think there were several partnerships that were focusing on this idea of cross-advising. Are any of you familiar with that? So it's having somebody from the four-year institution who understands early childhood education and understands the transfer process embedded at the community college to provide services to the community college students who anticipate going to that four-year institution. So one of the things we talk about in the report is the fact that if you go through all of this effort to develop a highly formalized articulation agreement, if you don't have sound advising practices to communicate that agreement to the students and to transfer coordinators and to advisors, then all of that hard work might have been for naught. So we felt that cross-advising was a good idea. It was just one example of an enhancement to the advising process. But we felt as though it served not only an academic and advising, but also a cultural bridge between the community college and the four-year institution. And it was actually associated with best practices in advising described by CARP and the Council for Independent Colleges. However, on the negative side, well, this is a positive too. It's described as a high-touch service. So it requires a lot of energy and effort to do it. Like one four-year institution might have difficulty sending a cross-advisor to multiple community colleges. So the question remains, how do we bring such advising practices that seem so promising to scale, and how do we establish their cost effectiveness? And another thing related to, can you go back for a second, Dan? To cross-advising is that a lot of people argue that private four-year institutions might be better able to provide such services to their students relative to public four-year institutions. And we just talked about the cultural bridge, and this is related to, are any of you familiar with Tinto's theory of integration? So it's the, you are, okay. Oh, I'm not going to pick on you. You were just scratching your eye? Okay. Normally I get 10 minutes at conferences to speak. Sometimes 12. Sometimes 12. Let me get a drink of water. So the idea of integration is institutions attempt to create an environment that allows a given student to develop a psychological or social attachment to a given institution. But it's generally from the context of students who directly enroll at four-year institutions. And the idea is that if you create this environment where they develop this attachment, they're less likely to drop out. And the same idea is with this cultural bridge, which you can do by engaging in sound advising practices. If you want to skip ahead a couple bullets. So there's also this idea in the literature called transfer shock, and it's usually from an academic perspective that transfer students, once they arrive at their four-year institutions, tend to have lower GPAs than what they did at their sending community college. But we feel that could be partially due to a lack of integration. So we think that anything that the partnerships do that could build a cultural bridge, which would allow the transfer students to be active in both institutions during their first 2 years, might help ease the transition. And, okay, sorry, I'm mixed up. So the last thing we're going to talk about is articulation and early commitment. A lot of the partnerships described all of the efforts they went through to develop highly structured transfer pathways. This seemed to be a common goal with an overwhelming majority of the partnerships. We found that specificity was the key to such agreements in terms of both the sending and the receiving institutions, so the community colleges and the four-year institutions. But you also need to be specific with the majors and specific with the articulated courses. It's very, very complex. And slight deviations from the plan or uncertainty about the major from a student's perspective at the beginning of one's college career might necessitate additional time to bachelor's degree completion. So it could throw them off that structured pathway. So we argue that more must be done to get community college students who are potentially interested in early childhood education to commit to early childhood earlier in their academic careers. And a couple people mentioned dual credit is a possible way to do it. Are you all familiar with dual credit? So it's providing the opportunity to earn college credit at the high school, which also kind of serves as a cultural bridge between the high school and the community college. But I think it could serve multiple purposes. You could get more students to commit early on. Plus, if they have any difficulty their first year at college, they've already banked 3 or 6 or even 9 credit hours. So if they deviate slightly from that pathway, they could easily get back on track. I have one more slide, and then I'm going to yield the microphone to Dan. So we also developed some recommendations for practice. Now, these are things that we viewed could be done that aren't all that expensive and that might be somewhat easy to do for new partnerships that are being developed in the second round of the grants. We think that it's highly important to frame discussions and goals using a student-centric approach. That's why we're all here. We're all here for the students. Somebody described articulation in a bad way. They called it the A word. So don't start off your discussions talking about formalizing articulation. Start off your discussions talking about how what you're doing will benefit the transfer students. Okay. Also, include the necessary players at the table. And this is from a couple different perspectives. The first one being try to involve upper-level administrators who might be able to push through decisions. Let them know what you're doing, and they'll buy into the grant. Also involve other faculty members who might be interested in the work you're doing. I think any communication of what you're doing is important. So cast a wide net. Another thing that might be fairly easy to do, which came across in a lot of the responses as being very important, rotate your meeting sites. If you're going to receive money in the second round, I encourage you to do this. A lot of people mentioned how this allowed all of the individual partners to gain a contextual understanding of what was going on at their partners' institutions, not only in terms of their programs, but in terms of the students. Another thing you could do is hold your meetings, not all the time, but at least once or twice in an informal setting. I know when we go into a boardroom, we tend to act proper. Somebody mentioned how they had a meeting at somebody's house, and it seemed to break down some of those barriers. It broke down some of the formality, and they actually made a lot of progress in terms of developing their partnership that way. And I think they drank a bunch of wine, too. I don't know. I wasn't invited, so I'm not sure. Also, integrate community-based entities into your partnership. These are the sites that'll probably house your early childhood educators that are going through your program. So fully bring them into your partnership as well. Also, partnership development theory kind of focuses on communication between the partnership, but within institution communication is important too. So be constantly talking to your bosses and administrators, letting them know what you're doing and letting them know about the importance of your work. Also, use technology to supplement traditional face-to-face meetings and enhance the flow of communication between partners. Don't use technology as a way to get rid of face-to-face meetings, because these were very, very important in the views of a lot of the respondents. Now I yield the floor to Dan Duffy.
Don't worry, this isn't the halfway point, so I just have a few slides here. I'm going to wrap up what Dr. Lichtenberger was talking about. So if you're like me and your mind's been wandering towards dinner, now's a good time to tune in. So one of the major themes that was discussed was the need for continuity. So this is kind of talking about how we make the work, how you make the work that you previously done live longer than the grant process to make it sustainable for years to come. The other thing that was talked about in this process was making sure that the work outlives the people who are currently working at the institutions. So a lot of them talked about how before they started this process that there was mumblings and whispers of some articulation agreement that may have existed, but there's nothing that could be tracked to it. So the importance here is to make sure that this work doesn't need to be replicated again 5 years from now. So another important factor was how the grant shown many barriers, but also the catalysts were right along there too. So there's the grant helped give people the necessary jump they needed to get over these hurdles. The other thing that was very important was that the grant itself provided the integration of many of the other things that you have been working on, such as the gateways and EdTPA and other credentials. And then the last, or the close to final thought here, was that the grant necessitated accountability. And this is 2 parts. Not only did the grant make partners accountable because they received the grant funding, but also made the grant recipients accountable to one another. So the 2 years to other 2 years, the 4 years to the 2 years, and vice versa. Everybody was held accountable for work they've wanted to be doing this entire time, but have been inhibited by other institutional barriers that they have of the many things you do at your institution. So this is our final thought. And this is my favorite slide. There was a discussion about how there are no mean people in early childhood. And I found that I'm an outsider. I'm in clinical psychology. And there's some mean people. Freud was pretty mean, seen with Aaron Beck, Albert Ellis especially. But a consistent theme was that there were no mean people, and there were of the same heart. As we talked about, there was that shared values, and many times that was the motivating factor to educate the people who are educating the young and earliest learners in the state of Illinois. Again, early educators are not mean people and very creative when given the opportunity. The grant work and the ability to work on the gateways, credentials, and EdTPA while working on articulation agreements shows the creative nature of the people in this room. Also, finally, everyone in early childhood education is nice, and that is self-exclamatory. So with that, we'll go to questions. Yeah.
Good job, Dan. I'll let you answer.
Okay. Do they need this one? Yes, you in the back.
Hi. I was wondering, it arises out of some conversation this morning and then listening to your discussion. I hope there are some plans, or if there aren't, plans will be made to take the results of these grants and all these agreements people have worked so hard and thought about and in some way integrate that with the work or use it to inform the work of the IAI panel. It just seems like different things are happening to the same purpose, and that's making it even more confusing. And that would be a great result of this grant if it somehow informed the IAI panel work. Yeah, her question piggybacks on it, so she's going to say it.
Okay.
Did you have a response, or, I'm sorry?
Actually, Stephanie Bernatite and I just submitted a proposal to the College Changes Everything conference, and we're going to focus on all of the wonderful articulation-specific activities that occurred as a result of the grant in hopes of allowing not only other programs within education, but other programs at community colleges and four-year institutions that kind of piggyback on all of the hard work that you've done.
But people seem to have to do two things. They've done this grant work, and then they also have to go to the IAI panel in relation to the same stuff. Something seems silly about that.
That was actually part of my question. So I can't remember the specific phrase that was used, but in the first round of grants, and I think in the second round as well, the phrase was a primary requirement or a primary, somebody help me here, but was articulation. That was one of the initial requirements of the grant. And so I wondered if data were available or if data had been captured on what the net impact on articulation relative to these grants had been, either in terms of number of courses or.
We are hoping to do that potentially with, should I say, with the entities that receive a second round of funding. We're gonna look into that specifically, seeing how many new people are entering the transfer pathways and so on.
So it wouldn't be captured with the first round of grantees, that data would not be captured, or?
I guess we always could, but we don't have the hook of the fact that all of the first round grantees are not eligible for a second round of funding.
But isn't there reports that they created that would have this information about what courses were created to articulate? I mean, that's part of it. Doesn't that information exist somewhere now? They've done this work.
It does.
Created
We captured
reports.
some of it through the reports that you guys put on the Dropbox. And Stephanie and I are in the process right now of going through and pulling those out and making sure, de-identifiable, because some people were nervous about that. We plan to sort of organize and sort those on the HERO website so that people can go in and start looking at what's coming about. And with the implementation grants and a possible evaluation of those, we do hope to not only track who's getting an implementation grant and what the ongoing effect was, but we'd love to reach out to some of you as well at that time who didn't get an implementation grant and say, 6 months later, you had high hopes, what happened? No judgment, just to understand sort of how all these kind of grants play out. And just to kind of remind you guys about why we did this, I know listening to some of these things, you guys are probably like, of course, this is a no-brainer. These are really important things for us to capture at a state level, right? I mean, because it's really important not only for us to be able to say, oh, look, these grants were worth it and they did a really good job. Pat us on the back, we did this great, we'll tell our federal officers we did great. But also, it really helps to just sort of move forward the field and move forward the thinking, and if other opportunities come up, we can say, wow, look how successful these were, or what made for the most success, right? Like what part of that grant really worked, or what part didn't work, or what would be worth replicating and what wouldn't. So, so that's all kind of part of why all this is coming out. I should never give me the microphone.
Thank you, Kristen.
Sorry, I have a quick question. I don't have a quick one, but if you looking at it, one of the things is the grants are sort of all these little individual pilot sort of studies of like how it could be done. I'm wondering if you could pull out what would be a policy implication that you feel that we could then push up from the grants? Because I think that that's ultimately where we're sort of thinking of going. Like, why do we have policies that make this work so hard and so messy? So did something come out of it that...
I think that relates to the question back there.
Right.
Why do we have to go through IAI again?
Yeah, right. Like, where that sort of thing. Like, so is there something that came out out of the work that we've done, or it is, go ahead and have messy policies, we're all really smart, we can figure out how to deal with it. I don't know if that's it, or is there something broader that you could pull out of it that you would recommend as a policy, down the road for people who are making decisions about how to run?
That was something I didn't consider until now, but it's a wonderful idea.
So another question of things to do, just because I was one of those, and I will admit to it, that said the two-year colleges didn't get any chance to actually have the money. And so I would like to know how much money actually went to the 4 years and went to the 2 years. Is there a way to pull that out to show that sometimes it wasn't a true partnership in that the 4 years are, and I understand they got the grants so they could do what they want with them, but I still think we need to be considering if you're asking for a partnership and for articulation, then some of the times the 2 years should get the money so that we can leverage what we want on our end too.
No, I think that,
And I know the grant didn't allow that, but I'm saying in the future that really needs to be considered.
yeah, I think, I will say that actually there was a lot of consideration put into that decision. I know it wasn't always the most popular decision, but there was a lot of conversation and consideration put into it. There's always trade-offs, no matter which way you go in which direction, and for these particular grants, for this particular purpose, we thought this was the best direction at this point in time. We can look into how funding was distributed, but for the goals of this grant and the work and where we felt the field was at this point in time, we felt that that was the best lever to use. So, but I understand the sentiment, and I understand the feelings. We weren't surprised when we heard that come back from the interviews. There were just trade-offs.
The only other thought I would add is that your request to do some analysis of the budget piece is something that we are taking a look at, but in evaluating and working with partners over time, there was an expectation that while an institution served as a PI, the budget would reflect partnership in terms of funds being dispersed to two-year institutions for consultative, buyout, or other kinds of time on the part of the two-year faculty involved. So there was attention paid to that throughout monitoring how the grant monies were being dispersed each quarter. But I appreciate you asking that, and we can try to provide some more detail on that. I know there might be some additional questions, but while I have the mic, I did want to mention that we're going to have an opportunity to hear from grant partners throughout the conference with more detail about their work. Tonight at dinner, there will be several partnerships represented. Tomorrow morning in roundtable sessions, partners will be presenting on specific topics about ways they tackle different challenges and opportunities in their work, and there are some breakout sessions too that focus on these. So if you look at the agenda and see something of particular interest to you, we're hoping that there's an opportunity for you to have candid conversation and then learn and work together with the faculty who were deeply involved. But let me hand the mic back to Eric because I recognize there might be some additional questions.
No other questions?